They laughed at the widow for covering her roof with pointed stakes, until they discovered why. Margaret Hayes was breathing heavily as she climbed another step of the aluminum ladder, carrying yet another pointed wooden stake in her hands. At 62, a widow for only 8 months, she had become the most talked-about topic on Hope Street in the Newtown neighborhood of Aspen. What no one understood was why this woman, once so sensible and respected in the community, now spent her days covering her roof with hundreds of sharp pieces of wood, turning her house into a veritable fortress of points. It was right after the first winter storm that Margaret began her mysterious project. Without telling anyone, not even her daughter Jennifer, who lived in New York, she showed up at Mr. Walter's hardware store and bought 40 pounds of wood already cut into stakes. The salesman thought it was strange, but didn't question it. After all, since she lost her husband David in a traffic accident, Margaret had completely changed her way of being. The first neighbor to notice was Mrs. Dorothy, who had lived in the house next door for over 30 years. In the morning, when she went to water her plants, she saw Margaret high up on the roof dressed in a thick, dark green coat, a black wool hat and gloves, forcefully hammering a stake into the shingle. The noise was deafening, and always began at exactly 7 in the morning. Dorothy tried to strike up a conversation, shouting from the backyard, "Margaret, what are you doing up there? Isn't it dangerous?" The reply came curtly, without Margaret even looking down. "I'm solving a problem that only I can see, Mrs. Dorothy. Don't worry about me." The strangeness spread quickly through the neighborhood when, on the third day, Margaret had covered the entire first row of the roof with the pointed stakes, all perfectly aligned and evenly spaced. It looked like a macabre work of art, or a trap for something no one could imagine. The children on the street began to invent haunted stories about the house of the stake witch. Little Matthew Ryan, only 7 years old, came home crying, saying that Margaret was preparing the house to wait for giant bats. His mother, Rachel, a postal worker, laughed at her son's imagination, but inside she was worried about the neighbor's eccentric behavior. During the second week, when Margaret had already covered half the roof, the condominium manager, Mr. Richard Thompson, appeared at her door with a notice. He was an elegant man, always well-dressed, who took his administrative duties very seriously. "Mrs. Margaret, I need to speak with you about these modifications you are making to your house." Margaret opened the door, wearing the same green coat she used to work on the roof. Her graying hair was tied in a messy bun, and her hands showed several small cuts from the wooden spikes. "What is it, Mr. Thompson?" "Look, we've received some complaints from neighbors about safety. These points could be dangerous if someone falls from the roof or if there's strong wind." "No one will fall from my roof because no one should be up there in the first place," Margaret replied firmly. "And as for the wind, I know what I'm doing." "But Mrs. Margaret, we need to think about the neighborhood. What if a child? The children on the street have parents to look after them. I have my house to look after, excuse me." And she closed the door in the manager's face, leaving him standing on the porch with the undelivered notice in his hands. The situation became even more tense when Jennifer, Margaret's daughter, showed up unexpectedly on a Saturday afternoon. At 34, Jennifer was an advertiser in New York and had driven 3 hours after receiving worried calls from several neighbors about her mother's mental state. "Mom, what kind of madness is this?" was the first thing she said upon seeing the roof covered in stakes. Margaret, who was organizing more wood in the backyard, didn't even turn to greet her daughter. "Hi, Jennifer. I didn't know you were coming." "What do you mean you didn't know? Mrs. Dorothy called me saying you'd gone crazy and were turning the house into a medieval fortress." Mrs. Dorothy should mind her own business. "Mom, look at me, look at me." Jennifer grabbed Margaret's arm firmly. "What's happening to you? Ever since Dad left, you haven't been the same person." Margaret finally stopped what she was doing and looked into her daughter's eyes. For the first time in weeks, her expression softened. "Jennifer, my daughter, I know it seems strange, but there are things you don't understand, things that only someone who lives here every day can notice." "What things, Mom? Explain to me what these things are." "I can't explain something you don't want to believe." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of laughter coming from the street. 3 teenage boys passed by on bicycles, pointing at the roof and making nasty comments. "Look at the crazy lady with the stakes. Looks like a haunted house. She must be preparing for Halloween all year long." Jennifer saw her mother's face turn red with anger and embarrassment. "Mom, do you see? You're becoming a laughingstock. This isn't normal." "What isn't normal is people caring more about other people's lives than their own problems," replied Margaret, going back to organizing the wood. That night, Jennifer tried a softer approach. She prepared her mother's favorite dinner: rice, beans, steak with onions, and toasted cassava flour, and they sat to talk at the kitchen table, where so many family meals had happened over the last 20 years. "Mom, I know losing Dad was very hard for you. It was for me too. But what you're doing, it's not a healthy way to deal with the pain." Margaret chewed slowly, thoughtful. "Jennifer, your life in New York is hectic. You work too much. You live far away. It's natural you don't understand some things about here. Then help me understand, why are these stakes so important? Because—" Margaret hesitated, as if deciding whether or not to tell something very intimate. "Because there are things your father saw that only I can see now. Things that need protection." "Protection from what?" "It's not from something bad, Jennifer. It's protection for something good. Something that could disappear if I don't take proper care of it." The cryptic answer left Jennifer even more confused and worried. That night she lay awake listening to the sounds of her mother moving wood in the backyard until late hours. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. On Sunday, Jennifer woke to the sound of hammering coming from the roof. It was only 6:30 in the morning and her mother was already working. She ran to the backyard and saw Margaret high on the ladder, installing more stakes, even with the dense fog covering the mountain town. "Mom, it's too early and you could slip in this fog." "The fog doesn't bother someone who knows every shingle on their own roof," Margaret shouted back, not stopping her work. "At least come down from there and let's have coffee together. It's been a while since we've talked properly." Margaret stopped for a moment, looked at her daughter and sighed. "All right, but then I need to finish this section before the afternoon wind." During coffee, Jennifer noticed her mother had lost a lot of weight. Her clothes were loose and there were deep, dark circles under her eyes. "Mum, are you eating properly? Sleeping well?" "I'm eating what's necessary and sleeping what's possible." "What does that mean?" "It means sometimes we have priorities more important than eating and sleeping." Jennifer tried a different approach. "What if you let me help with these stakes? I can at least hold the ladder to make it safer." Margaret's eyes shone for a second, as if she would accept the help, but soon grew serious again. "No, Jennifer, this is something I need to do alone. It's too personal." "More personal than the relationship between mother and daughter." "Different, not more important. It's something only your father and I understood." The mention of her father brought tears to both their eyes. It was the first time Margaret had spoken of him since the funeral. "Would Dad understand what you're doing?" "He wouldn't just understand, he'd help me if he were here." Jennifer spent the rest of Sunday watching her mother work, trying to decipher the pattern of the stakes, looking for any clue that would explain that behavior. She noticed Margaret wasn't placing the wood randomly. There was a specific spacing, a uniform height, as if following some very well-planned technical design. In the late afternoon, as she prepared to return to New York, Jennifer made one last attempt. "Mom, do you promise you'll go to the doctor this week, and that you'll call if you need anything?" "Jennifer, I'm not sick. I'm resolving something that needs to be resolved." "Promise you'll call?" "I promise I'll call if I really need to." It was all Jennifer could get from her mother that day. Monday brought new complications for Margaret. Mrs. Dorothy appeared at her door, accompanied by the retired nurse, Mrs. Ruth, who lived 2 houses down. "Margaret, dear, we're worried about you," said Mrs. Ruth in her motherly voice. "Working so hard, alone in this cold, that can't be good for your health." "My health is fine, thank you." "Let me at least check your blood pressure." "As a nurse, it's my habit to look after the people in the neighborhood." Margaret hesitated. Mrs. Ruth had always been kind to her, and unlike the other neighbors, didn't seem to be there out of malicious curiosity. "All right, you can check." When Mrs. Ruth finished taking her blood pressure, her expression grew worried. "Margaret, your blood pressure is quite high, 170 over 100. That's dangerous. It must be from the effort of working on the roof, or from the stress of doing all this alone. Why won't you accept help from someone?" because no one would understand what needs to be done. Mrs. Dorothy, who had been quiet until then, decided to speak. "Margaret, we've been your neighbors for decades. If you explain, maybe we will understand." Margaret looked at the two women, both in their 70s, who had known her since she moved to the street with David, newlyweds. For a moment, it seemed she would open up. "It's about preservation," she finally said, "about keeping something alive that might disappear if not cared for properly." "Preservation of what?" asked Mrs. Ruth gently. "Of something my David loved, and that only I can care for now." The two neighbors exchanged understanding glances, thinking it might be some kind of garden or special plant that David cultivated. "If it's to preserve something that was important to David, we can certainly help," offered Mrs. Dorothy. "You can't because you don't know how to observe like he did, and like I do." After the neighbors left, Margaret returned to work on the roof with even more determination. The wind was stronger than normal, and some of the already installed stakes were swaying dangerously. That's when the first accident happened. One of the stakes, poorly secured because of the wind, came loose and fell into Mrs. Dorothy's backyard, piercing through her small vegetable garden and destroying a bed of lettuce she had been lovingly cultivating for months. Mrs. Dorothy, who had until then tried to be understanding, became outraged. "Margaret, your wood destroyed my vegetable garden." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Dorothy. I'll give you money to buy new seedlings." "It's not about money, it's about safety. What if it had hit me or hit a child?" "It won't happen again. I'll reinforce the fastening." "Margaret, this has to stop. You're putting us all in danger with this obsession of yours." The word obsession hit Margaret like a punch to the stomach. Was that how everyone saw her now? As an obsessive and dangerous woman? "It's not an obsession, Mrs. Dorothy. It's a necessity." "A necessity for what? To hurt someone?" "A necessity to keep a promise." "What promise?" Margaret didn't answer. She picked up the stake that had fallen and climbed back onto the roof, ignoring the neighbors' protests. That night, alone in the house that now echoed too much without Robert's presence, Margaret sat on the living room sofa and finally allowed the tears to come. It had been 8 months since she lost her husband, and it seemed the pain only grew with time, instead of fading. She picked up a photo of the two of them from the coffee table. It was from their last wedding anniversary in May. Robert was smiling that smile that made her fall in love all over again, every day. In the photo, he was pointing at something above them outside the frame. "Robert, am I doing the right thing? Everyone thinks I've lost my mind." Of course, the photo didn't answer, but Margaret could almost hear her husband's voice saying, "Margaret, you always knew what was right. Don't change now just because they don't understand." The next day, Tuesday, the situation escalated further. The building manager, Mr. Richard Thompson, returned, this time accompanied by 2 other residents of the condominium, the retired lawyer, Dr. Patterson, and the teacher, Mrs. Helen. "Mrs. Margaret, this time I won't accept you closing the door in our faces," said Mr. Thompson firmly. "We need to talk seriously." Margaret received them in the living room, serving coffee, trying to maintain civility even though she knew it was a kind of tribunal forming in her home. Dr. Patterson, a 68-year-old man, thin and wearing glasses, went straight to the point. "Mrs. Margaret, these modifications you're making could constitute alterations to the building facade without condominium authorization. This could result in a fine and even a court order for removal." "I'm making modifications to my own house, Doctor." "But the modifications affect the safety and aesthetics of the complex. Just yesterday, a stake fell into Mrs. Dorothy's backyard. Mrs. Helen, a 50-year-old woman, a retired Portuguese teacher, tried a more maternal approach. "Margaret, we've known each other for years. We know you're a sensible person. This phase you're going through, it's normal after a loss, but you need professional help, not isolating yourself with this project." "I'm not isolating myself. I'm fulfilling a responsibility." "What responsibility?" insisted Mr. Thompson. Margaret took a deep breath. Part of her wanted to explain everything, but she knew they wouldn't believe her. "It's a promise I made to my husband before he passed." "What kind of promise involves turning a roof into a trap?" asked Dr. Patterson sarcastically. "A promise to care for something he loved." "And he loved wooden stakes?" Mrs. Helen tried to understand. He loved what these stakes are going to protect. The three visitors exchanged looks of people dealing with someone who clearly wasn't psychologically well. Dr. Patterson picked up a folder he had brought. "Margaret, I've brought some pamphlets here about support groups for widows, numbers for psychologists specializing in grief. I think it would be good for you to take a look." "I don't need a psychologist. I need to finish my work." "What if we helped you finish it?" offered Mrs. Helen. "Maybe working as a team would be safer and faster." "You don't know what needs to be done." "Then teach us," insisted Mr. Thompson. Margaret fell silent for a long moment, looking out the window at her roof, half covered in stakes. "It's not something you teach, it's something you feel, and you don't feel what I feel." After the three had left, Margaret climbed onto the roof with more urgency. She felt time was running out, that she would soon be forced to stop the project before completing it. And that couldn't happen. She worked until dusk, installing 15 more stakes in perfectly organized rows. Her hands were bleeding from small cuts from the rough wood, but she felt no pain. She felt only the urgent need to finish. On Wednesday, an event would completely change the dynamic of the situation. Jennifer appeared again, this time not alone. She brought with her Brian, her boyfriend of 2 years, a 36-year-old civil engineer known for his practicality and logic. "Mom, I brought Brian to take a technical look at what you're doing. Maybe he can understand the structure you have in mind." Brian greeted Margaret respectfully and asked to examine the roof. He climbed a borrowed ladder and spent almost an hour observing the pattern of the stakes, measuring spacing, checking the fastenings. When he came down, his expression was that of someone who had discovered something interesting. "Mrs. Margaret, may I ask a technical question?" "You may." "These spacings, do they follow a specific calculation? Because they don't seem random." Margaret looked at Brian more carefully. He was the first person to notice there was a technical pattern to her work. "Yes, they do." "Based on what?" "On observation. Years of observation." "Observation of what?" Margaret hesitated again, but something in Brian's respectful demeanor made her want to trust him. "Of behavior, of specific needs that must be met." Brian nodded thoughtfully. "And these needs, are they related to protection from wind? Rain?" "No. They're related to accommodation, to offering suitable spaces for housing." Jennifer, who was following the conversation, felt a light go on. "Mum, are you talking about animals?" Margaret looked at her daughter in surprise. You think you can understand?" "Try to explain it to me." "The birds, Jennifer. The birds your father loved to watch, that have been nesting on our roof for over 15 years. Brian and Jennifer exchanged looks of understanding. It was finally starting to make sense. "And the stakes are for," Brian continued, "to create more support points, more safe places for them to build nests. Your father spent years studying where they liked to settle, what height they preferred, what protection they needed from the wind." Margaret stopped talking and looked at the two young people, expecting the same judgment and disbelief she had found in everyone else. But Brian simply said, "That's really impressive. An urban wildlife housing project. Do you have data on how many species frequent the area?" Brian's technical and respectful question moved Margaret. Finally, someone was treating her work as something serious and valid. "Your father counted at least 12 different species, thrushes, kingbirds, warblers, doves. And they actually use the roof for nesting?" "Every year since we moved here. But in the last 2 years, with the new constructions in the neighborhood, many nests were destroyed. The birds were losing their breeding sites." Jennifer sat next to her mother and held her hand. "Mum, why didn't you explain this from the start?" "Because who would believe it? That an old widow knows about birds, that it's worth creating all this trouble for little creatures?" "They're not little creatures, Mrs. Margaret," Brian said seriously. "They are an important part of the urban ecosystem. And if the project is based on 15 years of observation, it has far more scientific value than any speculation." For the first time in months, Margaret smiled a genuine smile. That afternoon, Brian helped Margaret map out exactly where each species used to nest, identifying the patterns in their choice of location, height, and protection. Jennifer photographed the entire process, beginning to document what she perceived to be a pioneering urban preservation project. "Mom, do you realize what you're doing could be revolutionary?" said Jennifer. "Planned housing for urban wildlife based on real behavioral observation? I just know I promised your father I would take care of the birds he loved so much, and that if I don't do it soon, they might not come back next breeding season." Brian made some notes in his notebook. "Mrs. Margaret, may I suggest some technical improvements, ways to make the perches safer for the neighbors without harming their functionality for the birds?" "You would do that?" "More than that, I can document the entire project and present it to some colleagues who work in sustainable architecture. This could become a model for other urban areas." That night, for the first time since David's departure, Margaret slept peacefully, not just because she finally had allies in her project, but because she felt David would be proud to see their work being taken seriously and expanded. On Thursday, the news that there was a scientific explanation for the perches spread through the neighborhood, but not everyone was convinced. Mr. Thompson knocked on Margaret's door again, this time visibly annoyed. "Margaret, I heard you're making up this bird story to justify your stubbornness." "It's not made up, Mr. Thompson. My daughter and her boyfriend, who is an engineer, are helping me document everything." "Document what? An excuse to keep these dangerous traps?" Brian appeared at the door at that moment, carrying a folder with blueprints and photographs. "Are you the building manager? Perfect. I've brought the complete technical plans for what Mrs. Margaret is developing." Mr. Thompson examined the papers with suspicion, but had to admit there was a level of professionalism he hadn't expected to find. "This is all very nice on paper, young man, but in practice it's still dangerous and ugly. The dangerous part can be fixed with some modifications we've already planned, and ugly, well, that's a matter of perspective. For the birds, it's functional and welcoming. And for humans, it's an eyesore." Margaret, who had been quiet listening to the discussion, finally exploded. "Mr. Thompson, how old are you?" 72. "Why? Do you still remember what this street was like when you moved here?" "Of course I remember." "Do you remember the morning sounds, the bird song that woke us up every day?" Mr. Thompson fell silent, as if he were really trying to remember. "Do you still hear those sounds now?" "Well, not so much. Because there's no place left for them to live. Every new house they build, every tree they cut down, every roof they modernize with those smooth tiles, takes away a place where they can nest." Margaret's voice was thick with emotion. "My husband loved listening to their song every morning. It was the first thing he did when he woke up. Open the window and listen to the birds. Now that he's gone, I'm the one taking care of them. And I will keep taking care of them, with or without your approval." Mr. Thompson was speechless for a moment. The memory of the morning sounds from decades ago had truly returned to his mind. "Margaret, I understand the feeling, but I still think it's dangerous. Then help me make it safer instead of trying to stop me." Brian seized the moment. "Mr. Thompson, what if we called a building meeting to present the full project, with all the planned safety measures?" "A meeting?" "Yes. So all the neighbors can see exactly what's being done and why, and so they can give their input on the safety improvements." Mr. Thompson considered the proposal. "All right. But if the majority votes against it, you stop this, Margaret. Agreed?" "Agreed," replied Margaret, but inside she knew she would fight to the end, regardless of the votes. The meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday in the building's party hall. Margaret spent the next few days nervous, helping Brian prepare a complete presentation of the project. Jennifer returned on Friday with a surprise. "Mum, remember Professor Bennett from the State University, who was Brian's advisor in college? He agreed to come give a talk at the meeting about the importance of urban wildlife. A professor is going to talk about my project? Not just talk. He wants to study the project more deeply. He said it could be material for scientific research." Margaret could hardly believe it. What had begun as a personal, intimate promise to her husband was becoming something recognized academically. On Saturday, the party hall was full. Almost the entire neighborhood had shown up, including several people Margaret only knew by sight. Professor Bennett was a 55-year-old man, bald, with a greying beard and glasses, who radiated academic authority. Mr. Thompson opened the meeting. "We are here to discuss Mrs. Margaret's project on her house roof. She and her daughter's boyfriend will explain what they are doing." Brian began the presentation with technical data on the decline of urban wildlife, showing before and after photographs of building construction in the area. Margaret was impressed, seeing her personal intuition translated into scientific language. When it was her turn to speak, Margaret stood up with trembling legs. I'm not an academic like Professor Bennett. I'm just a retiree who loves the birds that share our space." She told of the 15 years observing nesting habits, about how David would note the arrival and departure times of each species, about the gradual decline of the bird population in the area. "When my husband passed, I promised him I would continue caring for the birds he loved so much. The perches aren't meant to hurt anyone. They're to offer more housing options for them." Mrs. Dorothy raised her hand. "Margaret, I understand your feelings. But what if a perch falls on someone's head?" Brian answered. "That's why we've planned safety modifications. We can use lighter materials, improve the fastening, create an integrated structure that is safe and efficient." Dr. Patterson asked, "And how much does this whole project cost? Who will pay?" "I will pay," said Margaret simply, "with my savings and my pension." "Margaret," said Mrs. Ruth gently, "wouldn't it be better to use that money to travel, take care of yourself, enjoy life? This is my way of enjoying life, by taking care of what matters." It was then that Professor Bennett asked to speak. "With your permission, I'd like to say a few things as an expert in urban ecology." The hall fell silent. "What Mrs. Margaret is doing even without academic training is pioneering in our region. Planned housing for urban wildlife based on long-term behavioral observation is extremely rare." He clicked the projector, showing images of similar projects in other countries. These projects in the Netherlands and Germany cost millions of dollars and involve teams of dozens of researchers. And Mrs. Margaret reached the same conclusions after observing for 15 years. Murmurs of surprise swept through the hall. More than that, she identified nesting preference patterns that are not documented in the scientific literature for this region. Her work could be fundamental to understanding how to preserve urban wildlife in mountain towns. Mrs. Helen raised her hand. "Professor, are you saying that Margaret's project has real scientific value?" "I'm saying it has exceptional scientific value, and I'm requesting permission to officially document it as a case study in my research." The atmosphere in the hall changed completely. People began to look at Margaret with respect instead of pity or irritation. Mr. Thompson raised his hand. "Very well, let's vote. Who is in favor of Mrs. Margaret's project with the proposed safety modifications?" One by one, hands went up. In the end, only 3 people voted against. "Approved by majority," announced Mr. Thompson. "Margaret, you may continue your project." Margaret broke down in tears of relief and happiness. Jennifer ran to hug her, and soon several neighbors joined in a collective embrace. Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we are just starting out. Now continuing. In the following weeks, Margaret's project turned into a true community mobilization. Brian organized volunteer work groups to implement the safety improvements. Mrs. Ruth volunteered to handle first aid in case anyone got hurt during the work. Even Dr. Patterson contributed, offering free legal consultation to formalize the project with the City Hall. The work progressed quickly with so many hands helping. The original stakes were replaced with a more elaborate structure, using lighter but equally functional materials. Brian incorporated small platforms between the stakes, creating different nesting levels for species of various sizes. Mrs. Dorothy, who had been one of the most resistant, surprised everyone by offering part of her backyard to expand the project. If it's going to help the birds, then let's do it right. Professor Bennett visited the project weekly, bringing biology students to observe and learn. Margaret, who had never set foot in a university, found herself teaching animal behavior concepts to future biologists. "Mrs. Margaret," said one of the students, "how did you know that the kingbirds prefer nests at 2.5 meters high?" by watching them for years. They always chose branches at that height when building nests in the trees. And how did you discover that the doves like more protection from the wind? Because on very windy days, they always sought out the most sheltered corners of the roof. The student's questions made Margaret realize her knowledge was more valuable than she had imagined, and more, that Robert had been her partner in this scientific observation without either of them knowing they were doing science. 1 month after the condo meeting, the project's first real test happened. The arrival of spring brought the birds back. Margaret woke up on a September morning to a sound she hadn't heard in months, dozens of birds singing. She rushed to the window and saw her structure full of activity. Kingbirds, thrushes, warblers, and doves were exploring the new nesting spaces. "Robert," she whispered, looking at the sky. "They're back." Jennifer appeared for breakfast and found her mother at the window, smiling as she hadn't smiled since losing her father. "Mom, just listen to that noise." "It's music, Jennifer. The music your father loved to hear most." That week the first nests began to be built. Margaret and the group of volunteers discreetly observed, noting which species chose which locations, validating or correcting the project's predictions. To everyone's surprise, species that had never been seen in the region also appeared, a pair of tanagers and even a small group of wrens, which normally preferred more rural areas. "Mrs. Margaret," said Professor Bennett during one of his visits, "your project not only maintained the original species, but attracted new ones. This is extremely positive for local biodiversity." The news of the project's success spread beyond the neighborhood. A journalist from the local newspaper appeared to do a story on the birdhouse. Later, a reporter from the regional TV station came to film a segment on urban sustainability. Margaret, who had spent months being ridiculed, now received visits from people from other cities interested in replicating the project. Architects, biologists, urban planners all wanted to understand how her system worked. "Mrs. Margaret," said an architect from Portland, "have you ever thought about turning this into a business, consulting for similar projects?" "It's not a business," Margaret replied categorically. "It's love for the birds and for the memory of my husband." But the suggestion planted a seed in Jennifer's mind. That night she talked to her mother. "Mum, what if we created an NGO to help other people develop projects like this?" "An NGO?" "Yes, the David Hayes Urban Wildlife Preservation Institute, in honor of Dad." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Jennifer, do you think he would like it?" "I think he would be proud to see his love for birds helping other communities." The idea of the NGO quickly gained momentum. Brian offered to handle the technical and legal aspects. Professor Bennett agreed to be the scientific advisor. Mrs. Ruth wanted to volunteer to care for the volunteers' health. Even Mr. Thompson offered to help with administration. 6 months after the project began, Margaret's house had become a model of harmonious coexistence between humans and urban wildlife. But the most important thing for her wasn't the recognition or the distinguished visits. The most important thing was waking up every morning to the song of the birds, as she had done for 15 years beside David. One particularly special December morning, Jennifer arrived early to find her mother already on the porch, drinking coffee and watching the nests. "Mum, count how many chicks you can see." Margaret picked up her glasses and observed carefully. "Let's see. 3 nests of kiskadees with 2 chicks each. 2 of thrushes with 3 chicks each. 1 nest of a dove with 1 little chick. Wow, Jennifer, that's 15 chicks. 15 new lives born thanks to your work." "Thanks to our work. Yours, Brian's, the neighbors, the professors. But it started with you, with your determination to honor a promise." Margaret smiled, thinking about how much she had changed since those first lonely days on the roof, when everyone thought she was crazy. "Jennifer, can I tell you something I've never told anyone?" "Of course, Mom." "On the day your father passed, in the hospital, in the last hours, he was a bit delirious because of the medication, but at one point he became very lucid and took my hand." Margaret paused, moved by the memory. He said, "Margaret, promise me you'll take care of our birds. They trust us." And I promised, even without fully understanding what he meant. And do you understand now? I understand that he knew I would need a purpose to move forward, and that taking care of the birds would give me that purpose. He was always wise, but I don't think even he imagined that this intimate promise would become all this, said Margaret, gesturing to all the activity around the house. At that exact moment, a van arrived with university students from New York, another group coming to learn about the project. Margaret stood up to greet them, already accustomed to the role of educator she had taken on. As she explained the logic behind each element of the structure to the students, Jennifer watched her mother's complete transformation. The lonely, grieving woman had become a respected community leader, a pioneer in urban sustainability, an example of how love can generate positive change. But most importantly, she had become a happy person again. At the end of that day, when the last visitors had left, Margaret sat back down on the porch for the ritual of watching the sunset with the birds. Jennifer joined her, and they sat in contemplative silence, watching the birds settling into their nests for the night. "Mum?" "Yes?" "Thank you for not giving up, even when all of us thought you were crazy. Sometimes you need to seem crazy to others to be sane with yourself." As night fell over Aspen, mother and daughter heard the last birdsong of the day from the birds that had found a safe home, thanks to the obstinacy of a widow who refused to break a promise of love. The next morning, Margaret was awakened by a different sound. Besides the usual birdsong, she heard human voices coming from the street. She looked out the window and saw a group of neighborhood children pointing excitedly at her roof. "Look, there's a new nest over there," said little Matthew Ryan, the same boy who months before had called her the steak witch. "And there are eggs over there," shouted a blonde girl of about 8. Margaret smiled, seeing that the children now saw her house as a source of fascination and learning, not fear. She went down to greet them. "Good morning, children. Would you like me to show you where all the nests are?" Their little eyes sparkled with curiosity. For an hour, Margaret found herself in the role of a biology teacher for an impromptu class of 10 neighborhood children. When the little ones left for breakfast, Mrs. Dorothy appeared. "Margaret, how lovely to see the children taking an interest in nature." "It's comforting, Mrs. Dorothy. It means the next generation will take better care of the environment than ours did." "Speaking of which, can I make a confession?" "Of course." "When you started with those steaks, I really thought you had lost your mind. Forgive me." "There's nothing to forgive. I would have thought the same thing if it were someone else. But now, my backyard is full of birds that come from your roof. It's a joy to wake up to their song. That's what community projects are for, Mrs. Dorothy, to benefit everyone." That afternoon, Brian appeared with news. "Mrs. Margaret, I have an important proposal to make." "Go ahead, Brian." "The city wants to include your project in the municipal sustainability plan. They offer funding to expand the model to other areas of the city." Margaret was speechless. "The city wants to fund my project?" "Not just fund it. They want to hire you as an official consultant for urban wildlife projects." "Me? A consultant? You have the most valuable practical knowledge in the region about urban bird behavior, and you've proven you know how to apply that knowledge." Jennifer, who had just arrived, overheard the conversation. "Mom, do you realize you're being professionally recognized for something you did out of love?" "It's strange. I always thought of a profession as something separate from personal life. Now I've discovered that sometimes they can be the same thing." The city's proposal led Margaret to a deep reflection. At 62 years old, after a life dedicated to being a housewife and spouse, she discovered she had a talent and knowledge that the world valued. "Brian," she said after thinking, "I accept the proposal, but on one condition." "What?" "I want part of the funding to go to an environmental education program for children, to teach them to observe and protect urban wildlife from a young age. I think the city will love that suggestion." And so it was. 3 months later, Margaret Hayes was officially employed as the urban wildlife specialist for the city of Aspen. At 62 years old, beginning a career she never even knew was possible. The educational program she developed served 5 public schools. Every week, Margaret visited the classrooms to teach the children about the city's birds, their habits, needs, and how to protect them. "Aunt Margaret," asked a 6-year-old girl during one of these visits, "how did you learn all this about birds? By watching them every day, paying attention to what they liked and what they needed. Is it like when we pay attention to our friends to know how they're feeling? The simplicity of the child's comparison touched Margaret deeply. That's exactly it, my dear. It's about paying attention and caring. 6 months after becoming an official consultant, Margaret received an invitation that completely surprised her. The State University wanted to award her an honorary doctorate for her services to environmental preservation. "Jennifer, I don't even know what that means," she said on the phone to her daughter. "It means you've become an academically recognized authority, Mum, without ever setting foot in a college as a student." Would your father be proud? Mom, Dad would be bursting with pride. The award ceremony was scheduled for a Saturday in May, exactly 1 year and 8 months after Margaret had hammered the first stake into her roof. On the day of the ceremony, the entire neighborhood mobilized to go to New York. Mr. Thompson chartered a bus to take all the project volunteers. Mrs. Dorothy insisted on sitting next to Margaret during the trip. "Margaret, do you remember when I said you had gone crazy?" "I remember, Mrs. Dorothy. I think sometimes we need a little bit of madness to do extraordinary things." At the State University, Margaret took the stage wearing a borrowed gown that was too big for her. When the dean announced her name, followed by the title of Honorary Doctor in Environmental Preservation, the auditorium erupted in applause. In her acceptance speech, Margaret spoke for just a few minutes, but her words deeply touched the audience. "When my husband passed away, I thought my useful life was over. I discovered that sometimes our true useful life only begins when we find something bigger than ourselves to care for. David taught me to observe the birds out of love. You have taught me that this love can become science, and that science can become social transformation." She paused, emotional. "I dedicate this honor to all the widows who think they have nothing left to offer the world. You do. You just need to pay attention to what you love and have the courage to act on that love." The applause lasted 5 minutes. After the ceremony, at an impromptu party in Margaret's backyard, the whole neighborhood celebrated together. The children ran among the adults, pointing to the nests on the roof and explaining to the visitors which species lived in each structure. Brian, now officially engaged to Jennifer, made a toast. "To Margaret, who taught us that love turned into action can change the world. To David," Margaret added, raising her glass, "who taught me that when you truly love something, you have to take care of it." When the party ended and everyone had left, Margaret sat alone on the porch, observing her roof teeming with life. There were now 23 active nests, housing 7 different species of birds. She took out a photo of David that she always carried in her pocket. "My love, who would have thought our intimate promise would become all this?" A flycatcher landed on the balcony railing as if coming to say goodnight. Margaret smiled. "Good night to you too. Sleep well, knowing you are protected." That night, for the first time since her husband's passing, Margaret slept completely at peace, knowing she had fulfilled her promise and much more. She had discovered that love, when channeled into action, can create legacies that transcend generations. The next morning, a special Sunday, Jennifer showed up early with a surprise. "Mum, I brought someone to meet you." It was a woman around 50, visibly nervous, accompanied by a teenager. "Mrs. Margaret, my name is Susan and this is my daughter Emily. We live in Santos and drove 4 hours to meet you." "Welcome, but why?" "Because we are urban beekeepers and we're facing the same problems you faced." "The neighbors think we've lost our minds for wanting to care for bees in our backyard." Margaret smiled, recognizing in Susan's anguish her own journey. "Sit down, let's talk. Would you like some coffee?" For 3 hours, Margaret listened to the story of Susan and Emily, who were trying to save a colony of bees threatened by the rampant urbanization of Santos. The problems were similar: misunderstanding from the neighborhood, bureaucracy, lack of technical support. "Mrs. Margaret," said Susan, "I read about your project and came to ask for help. How do we convince people we're not crazy?" "You don't convince them with words, Susan. You convince them with results, and with a lot of patience." "But it's so hard to stay strong when everyone thinks you're wrong." "I know, I went through that. But look," Margaret pointed to the roof full of nests. "When you're sure you're doing the right thing, The world ends up recognizing it. Emily, who had been quiet listening, finally spoke. Mrs. Margaret, did you ever want to give up? Many times, dear, especially when people I respected told me I was losing my mind. What did you do when you felt like giving up? I thought about my husband and the promise I made to him, and I remembered that some things are too important to give up on even when it's hard. Susan was moved. We came looking for hope and found much more than that. You found a support network, said Margaret, because now you are no longer alone in this fight. And so Margaret discovered a new mission within her mission, to help other people facing similar battles. In the following months, her house became a meeting point for urban environmental activists from across the country. An urban farmer from Philadelphia who wanted to turn vacant lots into community gardens. A veterinarian from Washington who rescued injured animals. A retiree from Chicago who taught children from the outskirts to care for plants. Everyone found in Margaret not only technical knowledge, but mainly encouragement to persevere, when society saw them as eccentric or dreamers. The house on Hope Street became informally known as the House of Environmental Hope. 1 year after receiving the title from the State University, Margaret was invited to speak at an international urban sustainability congress in Boston. It was her first international trip, at 64 years old. On the plane, looking through the clouds, she thought of David. Love, would you believe your old widow is going to represent the United States at an international congress? In Boston, Margaret presented her project to an audience of 500 experts from 40 countries. Her lecture, simultaneously translated into Spanish and English, was the most applauded of the event. A Dutch architect approached her afterward. Mrs. Hayes, I would like to implement your model in Seattle. Is it possible? A Japanese urban planner also showed interest. In Tokyo, we have similar problems. Could you consult with us? Margaret realized her small personal promise had sparked something with global impact. On the flight back to the United States, reflecting on the dimension her life had taken, she wrote a letter to David. My dear husband, I'm returning from Boston, where I spoke about our birds to people from all over the world. Who would have thought those mornings watching the kingbirds on our porch would become an internationally recognized technique? Today I realized you left me the most valuable gift you could, a purpose that makes me wake up every day knowing I have something important to do. Thank you for teaching me that truly loving something means caring for it forever, even when we don't fully understand why. Your birds are safe, and now they're inspiring bird care in many other places. I love you forever, Margaret. When she got home, she found Jennifer and Brian waiting with news. Mum, we have something to tell you. What is it? We're pregnant, and we want you to be the first to know that if it's a boy, he'll be named David. Margaret broke down in tears of happiness. Life, which had seemed to end with David's departure, was now multiplying in so many directions she could barely keep up. The following month, an official letter arrived from the UN inviting Margaret to join an advisory committee on urban wildlife for developing countries. Jennifer, she said, showing the letter, is this serious? Very serious, Mum. You've become a global reference. At 65, Margaret Hayes accepted her first international position. 6 times a year, she would travel to different countries, helping communities develop urban wildlife preservation projects. On her first mission in a slum in Lima, Peru, she taught a group of women to create nesting spaces for hummingbirds using recycled materials. On the second, in a suburb of Mumbai, India, she helped families build shelters for bats that controlled urban pests. Each project was different, but the principle was always the same. Observe with love, act with determination, persevere with courage. 2 years later, sitting on the porch of her home in Aspen, watching her grandson David crawl in the yard while birds sang on the roof that had transformed their lives, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple promise of love. What seemed like madness had become science. What seemed like obsession had become vocation. What seemed like an end had become a beginning. The spiked stakes the neighborhood had ridiculed were now studied at universities. The grieving widow everyone thought had gone mad was now consulted by international governments. But the most important thing wasn't the recognitions or professional achievements. The most important thing was the sound, The bird song that woke the family every morning, reminding everyone that when we truly love something and have the courage to act on that love, we create legacies that transcend our own lives. A kingbird landed on the arm of Margaret's chair, as it often did, as if it knew she was responsible for its home being safe. "David," she whispered, looking at the sky, "our promise became so much more than we could have imagined." The kingbird sang a long, melodious note, and Margaret was certain it was her husband's reply. "I knew you could do it, my love. I always knew." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. That same Sunday, something unexpected happened. A van stopped in front of Margaret's house, and 8 people got out, an elderly couple, 3 middle-aged adults, and 3 children. Margaret went out to see what was going on. "Are you Mrs. Margaret Hayes?" asked the oldest man, about 70 years old. "Yes, I am. My name is Robert Hayes. I came from Burlington, Vermont with my family. We drove 8 hours to meet you." "Because of the bird project?" "Not just for that. We came because my name is the same as your late husband's, and my story is similar to yours." Robert explained that he had lost his wife 3 years earlier, and since then had been obsessively dedicated to caring for the garden she had cultivated for 40 years. His children thought he was overdoing it. The neighbors commented that he had gone crazy over the plants. "When we heard your story on television, my granddaughter said, 'Grandpa, Mrs. Margaret would understand you.' And here we are." The granddaughter, a girl of about 12, stepped forward. "Mrs. Margaret, Grandpa takes care of Grandma's roses with so much love, but everyone says he goes overboard." Margaret looked into Robert's eyes and recognized the same pain, the same determination, the same love channeled into action that she had felt. "Robert, come in. Let's talk." The family spent the entire afternoon at Margaret's house. Robert told how he had turned a vacant lot next to his house into a memorial garden for his wife, planting over 200 species of flowers she loved. "Just like you with the birds, I observed for decades what my wife liked. I know exactly where each plant looks best, how to care for each one. And people think you're overdoing it? They say it's not normal for a 70-year-old man to spend all day messing with flowers. That I should move on with my life." Margaret nodded, understanding perfectly. "Robert, can I give you some advice?" "Please. Keep going, no matter what they say. When you truly love someone, caring for what that person loved is the most beautiful way to keep the love alive. But isn't it madness? If it is madness, it's the most beautiful kind of madness there is." The conversation moved Robert's entire family. The eldest son, who had been one of the most critical, approached. "Mrs. Margaret, talking with you, I'm starting to understand my father better. What he's doing is preserving decades of knowledge and love. That has immense value. I never thought of it that way." That afternoon, Margaret had a revolutionary idea. "Robert, what if we created a network to connect people who are going through similar situations?" "How do you mean?" "Widowers and widows who are caring for projects in memory of their partners, so they don't feel alone and crazy like we've felt." The idea immediately excited Robert. "Mrs. Margaret, that would be wonderful. There are so many people going through the same thing." And so the Roots Project was born, a national support network for people who channel grief into environmental or cultural preservation projects. In the following months, through Margaret's talks and word-of-mouth promotion, hundreds of people connected through the network: widows preserving medicinal gardens, widowers caring for community libraries, people keeping alive projects they had developed with their deceased partners. The Roots Project officially became an NGO, with Margaret as honorary president and Robert as regional coordinator for Vermont. Jennifer took over national coordination, transforming her experience in publicity into a tool to promote socio-environmental projects. 6 months after Robert's visit, the first national convention of the Roots Project brought 200 people together in Aspen. Widowers and widows from across the country shared their stories and projects. Mary Grace, from Miami, preserved a collection of over 1,000 species of medicinal plants that she cultivated with her herbalist husband. Richard, from the countryside of Louisiana, maintained a free music school in memory of his teacher wife. Each story was unique, but all had the same common thread: love transformed into action. During the convention, Margaret gave a speech that deeply touched everyone present. "When my husband passed, I thought my love story had ended. I discovered it had merely changed chapters. Now, instead of living love, I practice love. Instead of receiving care, I offer care. Love doesn't die when a person leaves. It transforms into a legacy." On the last day of the convention, there was a special ceremony, the official inauguration of the David Hayes Memorial Garden in the backyard of Margaret's house. Robert had traveled specially to plan and plant a garden to honor all the deceased partners of the network members. Each plant represented a story of love and preservation. Each flower was a symbol that grief can generate new life when channeled with purpose. The following spring, something magical happened. The memorial garden attracted even more species of birds, which came to feed on the nectar of the flowers planted by Robert. The Urban Wildlife Project integrated naturally with the Flora Project, creating a complex, self-sustaining urban ecosystem. "Robert," said Margaret in a phone call, "your garden has multiplied the efficiency of my project. Now we have 29 different species of birds. And your nesting structures protect my garden from pests naturally. It's a perfect partnership, just like our marriages were." The partnership between the projects caught international attention. A PBS documentary on urban sustainability dedicated an entire episode to the House of Environmental Hope in Aspen. The documentary showed not only the technical aspects of the projects, but primarily the human transformations. Neighbors who had learned to collaborate, children growing up connected with nature, elderly people who had found new purpose in life. Margaret, now 66, appeared in the documentary as a woman completely different from the one who had begun hammering stakes alone on the roof 3 years earlier. Radiant, confident, surrounded by people who respected and admired her. But the most important transformation didn't appear on camera. Margaret had begun to dream about the future again. "Jennifer," she said one afternoon, playing with her grandson David, "you know what my next dream is?" "What, Mum?" "I want this boy to grow up in a world where caring for nature is considered normal, not the exception. Where people like me and Robert are seen as visionaries, not as crazy. I think you're already building that world, Mum." "We are building it, dear, all of us together." That late afternoon, as she watched her grandson crawl in the memorial garden, surrounded by the song of dozens of birds that had a safe home thanks to a widow's love for a promise, Margaret felt certain that David would be proud to see how a simple decision not to break a promise had generated so much good for the world. The pointed stakes the neighborhood had ridiculed were now just the beginning of a quiet revolution of love transformed into action. A revolution that had begun on the roof of a house in Aspen and spread throughout the United States and the world, proving that sometimes the most important changes begin with gestures that seem too small to matter, but are made with love, too great to fail. The flycatcher that always visited Margaret landed on little David's toy, as if blessing the new generation that would grow up protected by the legacy of those who had the courage to transform pain into hope, grief into life, promise into revolution. And in that moment, observing the past she had honored, the present she had built, and the future she was preparing, Margaret Hayes knew she had fulfilled not only the promise made to her husband, but also the promise she had made to herself without realizing it, to continue living in a way that made life worth living. End of story. So, dear listener, what did you think of Margaret's journey? Did she make the right choice by persevering with her project, even when everyone doubted her? Leave your honest opinion in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. If you have a story of perseverance to share with us, we would love to read it. Thank you so much for your company. Don't forget to leave your like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories.